That'd be awesome. Okay, cool. Well, so we're going to jump into this and go through and talk about the real estate purchase contract. So as part of the 12-hour new agent course, the division says you have to spend 4 hours on the real estate purchase contract. Now, 4 hours really is more like 2.5 because, or I guess more than 2.5, probably 3. Anyway, they give you, it's broken down like a 1 hour isn't really an hour kind of a thing. So anyway, so Jason spent with you guys an hour and a half-ish or so on the real estate purchase contract last week. We're gonna now spend some more time on it this week. So last week was him going through and talking about basically how to fill it out. So today's gonna be more about going through and talking about the different sections and making sure that we all understand how things work on it. But we're really gonna spend most of the time on the areas that I see agents having issues or struggles with throughout my time as being the principal broker. So that's kind of the idea. So we'll go through and we'll spend a bit of time on some areas, and other areas we aren't gonna really probably spend a whole lot of time, because it's one of those things, if we're not seeing issues pop up from it, then I'm probably not gonna spend a whole lot of time there. But if I do see issues pop up, then we're gonna spend some time and we'll talk about some of the different things. So I'm gonna, not gonna talk about like filling in any of the blanks, because I'm hoping that you guys got all of that last week with Jason. But as we're going through this though, I do wanna make sure that if you do have specific questions, that we get them answered. So if you do have something you wanna talk about, a question you have on it, more than happy to spend even a little bit more time on it. I wanna make sure that this is relevant for what you guys are seeing or questions you're having and things. So, all right, so we're gonna just start with the earnest money section. So when the client fills this out, you're going to be collecting earnest money from them. So what the contract says is and I guess we'll just let's start on the property described below. And, sorry, I gotta minimize something on my screen here. All right, the property described below and agrees to deliver no later than 4 calendar days after acceptance as defined in section 23, and earnest money in the amount of however much. And then after acceptance of the REPC by the buyer and the seller, and receipt of the earnest money by the brokerage shall have 4 calendar days in which to deposit the earnest money into the brokerage trust account. So, based on that, how many days do we have to get the earnest money, get it received and deposited and all that?
It depends.
Okay, good. Okay, good. Well, that's what I want you to explain it to me. What do you mean by it depends?
Depends when you receive the earnest money. It depends on how many days you have left and when it's deposited. Like if you receive it or if they bring it into the brokerage. So it all can depend upon who takes receipt of that and when.
Okay.
Well, they have 4 days, calendar days after acceptance to, let's say they accept it. That's different because you have Friday, Saturday, and Sunday are not calendar days. So.
No, they are calendar.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. But also, if they do the full 4 days later, and you have 4 days, you can have up to 8 days.
Okay, good.
So, the calendar days will be Saturday and Sunday too.
Correct.
Right? The opposite to that will be what, working days?
Business days.
Business days,
Yeah.
okay, but
Yeah.
this one is calendar.
So good. So let's go through and make sure that this one is one that just gets so confusing. So here's how I always like to talk about it, is think of it as, and I don't know if you guys can, I guess you can see me on the screen. So think of it as 4 and 4. So we have 4 days, and again, back to the calendar days. We have 4 calendar days after acceptance in which to receive the earnest money. So we have 4 calendar days, and when is day 1 then? Is day 1 the day I receive it or the next day?
Isn't that the day you receive it?
So it's gonna start, you're gonna start your counting the next day. So if I receive the earnest money today, tomorrow would be day 1. So I have 4 calendar days after acceptance, which we'll talk about acceptance later on when we get to section 23. But we have 4 calendar days after acceptance. And so the key word to remember is after acceptance. So 4 days after acceptance. That's why we start the counting as day 1 being the next day after you receive it, okay? So we have 4 days in which to receive the earnest money, 4 calendar days. Then we have 4 separate days in which the brokerage has to get the earnest money deposited. So it could be up to 8 days. But the reason I like to do it, where I'm saying 4 and 4 on 2 different hands, 4 days to receive the earnest money, 4 days to deposit, is because the time frame in which to get the earnest money deposited, so where it's saying here, after acceptance of the REPC by the buyer and the seller, and receipt of the earnest money by the brokerage. So both of those things have to happen. First we have to get it accepted, then we have to have receipted the earnest money by the brokerage, and you getting it is receipt by the brokerage. Then we have the 4 calendar days in which to deposit the earnest money. So if we have 4 days to receive it, 4 days to deposit it, what happens then, and the reason I like to do it this way, is if I receive the earnest money, so we get it accepted today, client brings me the earnest money tomorrow, that's 1 day. So we've now received it within 1 day. How many days do we get total then in that scenario?
4.
Yeah, it'd be 5. Because we have we received it after day 1, and there's 4. So think of it, that's why I do 4 fingers on 2 different hands. If we get it after 2 days, we then have 4 days, so it would be a total of 6. So the answer on this is we have up to 8 days, but it depends on this first day, the receipt, this first 4 days is going to depend how many days total we get. Because if they bring it to us on the first day, we only have 5 days total. Versus when you read the contract, it sounds like, oh, well, we have 8 days. You follow me, Luz? Or did I
I'm
lose
kind
you?
of lost in there, but I never think about 8 days. I always, for me, it's 4, and worry about the 4.
Okay, good. Well, if you do that, you'll be
Yeah.
fine. If you just think about, I gotta get it within the 4 days and get it deposited, then you're good. But just keep in mind, a lot of times agents will say, well, we have 8 days.
And we don't.
Well, that's not true. You don't actually have, you have up to 8 days, but that time frame, it's the depositing of the earnest money kicks in the moment we receive the earnest money. So if we got it on day 1, we would only have a total of 5 days. If we got it on day 2, then you've got 6 days, 7 days, or if they took all 4 days to give you the earnest money. So probably the biggest thing for you guys to remember is, and I think I like the way you said it, Luz, is just think of it as I have 4 days from acceptance to receive the earnest money and turn it into the office.
That's it.
And as long as you do that, as long as you receive it within 4 days and turn it into the office, we're good. Now, where we sometimes run into problems on that though, is somebody may wait until the last minute to bring it in to us, which is fine, because as long as you've received it within 4 days and given it to us, fine. But sometimes agents will receive it maybe on day 2, and they're thinking, well, I still have 6 days. Well, that's not true. You only have, they would be thinking that they still had an additional 6 days, but you really only have the 4 days to deposit it. So just really the biggest thing is once you receive it, get it turned into the office ASAP.
So for what you're saying, the client can give it to us, because I see that clients sometimes prefer to be the ones to bring it in here and start the process.
Yeah, and that's fine too. If the client brings it into the office here and turns it in, that's totally fine, because we will then have received it and then we will get it deposited either that day or the next day. So as long as they're bringing it into us in that first 4 days, the second 4 days will be okay. Where we run into problems is they give it to you as the agent, maybe say on day 4, and then you as the agent are like, okay, well, I got it on Friday, and so now I have 4 days, but then maybe Monday's a holiday. So now you'd be Saturday, Sunday, Monday, the holiday, it has to be deposited by Tuesday, But where we see the problem is the agent shows up at the office at like 5 o'clock or 5 minutes to 5 and is like, hey, here's this earnest money. Oh, by the way, it's gotta be deposited today. So that's where we
So
run into the
what
issue.
you're saying, there's some agents that could be showing up on day 8 at 5 o'clock, is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Cool.
Yeah, don't wait till the end. Yeah.
Do a lot of agents do that? Is that?
Well, not a
Totally not.
lot.
I
Totally
mean,
not.
I don't know, it's like, to me, I guess just my brain, I'm like, those are two different deadlines to me,
Yeah.
right? One is 4 days to receive it, and one is those are complete, like, I don't know, I guess I'm like, why are we like, why do people get confused? Like, those
Yeah.
are different deadlines.
Yeah, but unfortunately, they don't think of it that way. They just think of it as, I have 8 days and instead of 4 and 4.
Yeah, the way I
Because you're right.
about the process, those 4 days are my problem. I want to get it done right there. The other ones, that's the brokerage
That's our
problem,
problem.
not mine.
Yeah, but you're right, and I wish more agents thought that way, but just occasionally, an agent will receive the earnest money and then they're thinking, oh, well, now I've got plenty of time to get it turned in. And so, yeah, once you receive it, best bet is just get it turned in. Because we have had scenarios where an agent has received the earnest money and then they just never turned it into us. And then come closing, it's like, we got a problem. Now, luckily, that doesn't happen very often.
Because I just finished my real estate exam 2 weeks ago, and that is like, I think it actually is within 72 hours on the real estate exam. It's like really fast.
Yeah, so,
And it's like
yeah, good.
pounded in you, like.
Yes, in real estate school, that is part of the challenge. So in real estate school, the way the law works is anytime you're given money, you have 72 hours to get it deposited.
Yeah.
The exception is
If it's in the contract, yeah.
if the contract changes it, but yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and that's where it kind of, I wish they would just change the law to say you got 4 days. Because if they did, then people would probably feel like, oh, okay, now it makes sense, but, yeah. So, okay. Any other questions or anything on that earnest money section? Okay, so just, yeah, as soon as you get it turned in. The only other thing that I will say on that is just, and Jason may have said it, but it's worth repeating again, is the earnest money for us receiving it, ideally, we want it to be good funds. So a cashier's check is gonna be the ideal way that we get the earnest money, but we'll take a personal check. So I wanna make sure you're clear on that. A personal check is fine, we will take it, but if for some reason the client then canceled the contract within a couple of days for whatever reason, we will not release the earnest money to them until we know it has cleared their account. So they've either got to bring in proof to us to show that it's cleared their account, or they'll have to wait 10 days until we can know, okay, we're pretty safe that it's not going to get returned to us.
So I put in my notes that it was between 7 and 10 days, so should I cross the 7 and just put 10 days?
Yep, typically it's 10 days is
10
what,
days,
yeah.
alright.
We're gonna wait 10 days to do that. So the other thing to make sure you're aware of is your clients can do it through Earnest, which is a website, and it's EARNNEST, so there's like an extra N in there, earnest.com. They can do it through that. There is I think a small fee to them to do it, but the nice thing is it's done and it's there into our account that way. So it's just put right into our account. So that's another way your client could do it, because especially like in today's world where I'm guessing, Dayton, you don't have a checking account, or do you?
I do.
Oh, good job, all right. A lot of times
But you have to pay for them to get checks, like I have a checking account, I don't have checks.
you don't have any checks, yeah, so there you go. So do you have checks?
No.
Okay,
Because
yeah.
they don't provide them anymore. You actually
Oh,
have to-
really?
No, you have to ask for them, and then
Yeah.
you have to pay for them.
Oh, okay,
But Ross, they can always get a cashier's check.
Yeah, the cashier's check.
yeah, you can do that, yes, that
I would say,
works.
I don't think most people have, like.
In today's world, yeah.
I do have checks.
I was gonna say,
Old-fashioned.
us old people still have checks,
Yeah, I have
but.
checks.
Well, like I did for my old accounts, but now, like my account I opened like 10 years ago, they didn't.
Yeah, yeah,
So.
We
So-
have Venmo now.
I know.
Yeah, we have-
Yeah, somehow we gotta get to where we could get Venmo as the earnest money, but we're not there yet. So earnest is the closest thing.
And so, I want to make sure there's no, cash is not an option.
Yeah, thank you. I was just gonna say, the two things that we don't accept is we're not gonna accept cash. So if the client wants to give you cash, have them go, get a money order or a cashier's check, either way. So yeah, we don't wanna take cash. And then the other thing that we don't do is a wire. So sometimes people wanna wire the earnest money to us, we're not gonna do that either. So, if it was a scenario where somebody's like, no, we have to do a wire, then we would probably say just have them wire it to the title company and, we'll, add the addendum for earnest money to be held at title, so. Yeah, great question, Jake. All right, any other earnest money questions for that section?
Did we have one of those?
No.
This is the old one from
Oh,
Jason.
okay, okay.
Reuse it.
Yeah, sorry, I probably should have put that in there, I just was assuming you would still have the one.
Ross, I already complained about it.
I know, she did, and I actually tried to print one, but I couldn't get this printer to print for some reason, so I apologize, but I don't have one for you.
You're fine.
Okay, next section is that we're gonna, and again, as I go through this, if I skip something you wanna talk about, stop me and we'll talk about it. But the next section that I wanted to hit on is talking about these included items. So I wanna point out just a few things on this one that are crucial that you understand. So under this included items, it says unless excluded herein, this sale includes the following items, and then the keywords that I wanna make sure to point out to you guys is if presently owned and in place on the property. So what does that mean if there is something in there in the property that's listed below? So let's just use solar panels as an example, and that it's a lease. Are they included or not included?
No.
Okay,
They're
then-
included because they're on the house.
Yeah, they are.
They're not movable solar panels.
okay, so
Say not included, because they don't own them, there's that thing that says presently owned.
yep, so those are the key words, is if they are leasing them, then the sale would not include those solar panels because and the key words here is if presently owned and in place on the property. So it has to meet both criteria. So the solar panels are in place, but they're not owned.
So in that situation, what do you
So say that
do?
again.
What do you do?
That's a great question. So the key thing with that, and the reason I brought up solar panels is because that is tends to be where we have the issues, is there is a solar panel addendum that
Okay.
you wanna make sure you use that solar panel addendum because it is gonna then clarify, are they owned? Are they leased? And if they are leased, are they gonna transfer the lease? Are they gonna have the solar panel company come take them off? So yeah, we just wanna make sure that we do that. But the same thing would apply for anything that is not owned by them, even though it might be in place in the property. Okay, so those are just the key words on that is they are included if they're presently owned and in place. So it has to meet both of those criteria, okay? And then just like I said, the reminder on solar panels, make sure you use that solar panel addendum that explains everything that way. The other thing to point out, and maybe Jason already did, but the section 1.2 there, the other included items, is just notice that after washer, dryer, refrigerator, microwave, all of them have an S at the end. Okay, good. So if he talked about it, then I'll skip that, but just don't forget that part. All right. The other thing to just point out on the water service, again, is the purchase of the property shall include all water shares and water rights, if any. So the same thing again here is if there are water shares or water rights, and then the key thing on this is that are a legal source of the seller's current culinary water service and irrigation water service. So it has to be a legal source for the seller's current, which usually we don't run into much of an issue on that.
Is there another addendum like for the solar panels? If somebody has water rights, but they say, I want to give the house so many, but I want to keep so many. I don't know if they can do that, but
So good question, yeah, so there's not a separate addendum, no. But so let me just restate what you were saying there. So basically, if they have some water shares and they're gonna sell or include part of them with the sale, but part not. So the key thing on it is, this section is saying that all water shares and water rights. So if you don't do anything, you would be including all of the water
All of
shares
them.
and water rights.
But if they don't want to do that?
If they don't want to do that, then there's a line right here that they can say the following water shares or water rights, if applicable, are specifically excluded from the sale. And then what you would want to do is detail it out is the seller will include X number of water shares with the purchase, and the X number will be excluded.
Yeah, because I heard of a seller that was thinking of selling, and he had water shares, but he says, I don't want to put all of them on the house, I want to keep some.
Yeah.
So this line in here,
So you would write it on that line right there.
okay, so there's no addendum, it's this line.
Yep, you would just write it in there, X number of water shares will be excluded from the sale, and that would work. So yeah, I actually had one, I helped my sister sell a property up in Charleston, which is by Midway, Heber. And during the time she owned the property, so when she bought it, you had to have, it was 1 acre of land, and you had to have one share of water in order to use the water for, if you wanted to irrigate that 1 acre. Well, during the time they owned the property, the city came through and put in a water meter, so you actually didn't need the water share anymore, you could just pay for your water. So when I listed her property, she said, you don't need the water share anymore, you can just pay for the water use. So what should we do? My recommendation was, don't include it in the sale, because you're not gonna get any more money, I didn't believe, for the house because of that. I said, let's not include it, but then we will offer to sell it outside of closing if they would like to buy it. She said, great, let's do that. So we list the property. I put on the MLS, I put in there that there was one water share available for purchase outside of, separate from the purchase of the house. We got the offer in, they didn't put anything on the blank lines here, so what would that mean that the buyer was asking us?
So there was, this line was
Blank, just like it is now, just like
it
what you
is
see.
now.
Okay, so they're expecting to have the rates.
So yeah, when they send it over, they're basically asking us to include it. So we did a counter offer back and said, we will not include the water share, but it could be purchased separately if they wanted to.
Okay,
And when we did that, they said, we'll let you know. Okay. During the process of them being under contract, the neighbor comes over and says, hey, what are you guys doing with your water share that you have? And my sister said, well, the buyer might buy it, they might not. The neighbor said, well, I'll buy it. So she sold it to them. Then right before closing, the buyer came and said, okay, we do want to purchase that water share.
oh no.
Too bad.
So I called my sister and was like, hey, they want to purchase it. Oh, I already sold it to my neighbor. I'm like, why didn't you tell me that? I mean, it was fine because it worked out okay, but just keep in mind, just because you put on the MLS, and so this is probably the key takeaway from this. Just because you put something on the MLS and say, this is not included. Maybe you say the refrigerator is not included, but in this case, we said water share is not included. If the buyer sends over the contract just like it is right here, right now, like this, it's included.
So when it's blank like that, is implying that whatever is in there is included with the
It's
property?
included with the sale, yep.
Okay.
So you as an agent, if they're not wanting to include it, you gotta make sure you catch that. Same thing up above here in terms of washers, dryer, refrigerator, microwaves. If they're not wanting to include it, you have to make sure that you catch that so just keep in mind, the MLS is an offering, like you're saying, this is what we're offering to sell and at this price. The real estate purchase contract though trumps what the MLS says. So it doesn't matter what the MLS says, it matters what the real estate purchase contract says. But that you will have, somewhere along the way, you're gonna run into somebody that says, oh no, we put on the MLS that wasn't included. But if it says included on the contract, it's included.
Does that happen very often?
Not a lot, but occasionally you'll have somebody that an agent that wasn't trained very well or whatever, that'll be like, no, I put it on the MLS. I mean, I would say once or twice a year, I see it as the principal broker, so you might see it 2 or 3 times in your whole career, but.
So when you see it as a personal broker, are you seeing from agents in this brokerage or somewhere?
No, usually it's somebody from a different brokerage that is saying, hey, we put on the MLS that we weren't including the water share, we weren't including the refrigerator or whatever. But if up here they had said they weren't including the refrigerator on the MLS, but you check the box that says refrigerators, they've now agreed to leave the refrigerators. So
they better have a reader contract.
yeah,
We just had 20 offers on our house out here, and half of them, we have 2 refrigerators, one we're taking, and the other one we're not, and half of them did the both. Like, I was like, oh, we just learned this, and I was like, no, that was not included, and like, our realtor's really great, I mean, I didn't sell it myself, so like,
yeah.
our realtor's great, but he was like, my husband's like, they did that again, and I was like, just get rid of the 2 refrigerators, I don't care.
Yeah, see, that's the best answer. That is the best answer, is to just tell the seller, if you're not wanting to include, let's get rid of it right now. Now, sometimes that's not like,
Doable.
it's probably always doable, but it could be an inconvenience. If you're saying we have 2 and we're not gonna include this one, but we will this one, it is way better to just get rid of the one.
Hey, or you could put in there if they come see the house or take the pictures or whatever, you can put right there a sign, not included.
No, but on the
Not
contract,
included.
But it's
again,
still,
it's on the contract, so
Yep.
they, like, half of them, when they were sending over their offers, would just click refrigerators.
Yep.
And then the other half would be top refrigerator, not included,
Yeah.
excluded, but it was interesting, like, I would say at least half of them.
So what is the case that we should put the serial number, because I think it was Jason that mentioned that they could swap a good fridge for some that is not so good. Kind of
Yes.
like, there's the fridge right there, but it was not what was there.
yeah, so that's where you would come back to again up here is, unless excluded herein, the sale includes the following items if presently owned and in place on the property.
Uh-huh.
And it would, so yes, it would have to be that one, but, and yeah, the ideal way would be to make sure, that you're getting a serial number or something like that. If I don't know how often that happens, that somebody trades, in fact, I don't know in my career that I've ever
So that,
heard it or seen it, but, I mean, I'm sure it's happened, no question, but yeah, but I think you would be okay if you had somehow could have proof, whether it was a picture from the MLS or something, to show.
Myself, my husband was about to switch the fridge when we were closing. And I was like, no, because they sold that one. And he was like, well, we didn't specify which ones we were gonna leave. And he was about to, so it is possible, people can do that. I was like, don't do it, because everything matches, so.
Yeah.
But it would be possible, and they couldn't say anything, right?
Yep. Well, did you say they can't say anything?
Yeah,
if
because
they
if we switch the fridge, because I didn't specify which fridge was
Well,
excluded.
so no, I would disagree. You couldn't switch it because it says if presently owned and in place. So it would have to be the one that is in,
place.
when the offer is accepted,
Yeah,
the
it has
one
to
that
be
is
the one
in
is
place
there. Oh,
is
okay.
what's
So
included.
what
So if
you're-
you swapped it, that would be a problem.
So in that case, the buyer could come after and say, hey, that was not what it was
Correct.
before.
Yeah, because
Correct.
it was.
And the buyer will win because of that, right?
Yep.
Okay, you see, I didn't know that.
Yep.
So,
Okay, perfect. All right, next. And Jason may have mentioned this, but I think it's worth repeating if he did. I'm just not positive if he did or didn't. But section 2.1 here, talking about the purchase price. So on this part, I'm sure he talked about, you're gonna put in whatever the amount is here, and then these should add up to that amount. But I just wanna always point out this section here that says, except as provided in this section, the purchase price shall be paid as provided in sections 2.1a through 2.1e below. Any amount shown in 2.1c and e, so C is the new loan and E is their down payment, may be adjusted as deemed necessary by the buyer and the lender. So basically, you don't have to do exactly what you list out on here, That sentence right there gives you flexibility to adjust 2.1 C and E. So you couldn't adjust the others, but if all of a sudden they wanted to put less money down, they could. If they wanted to put more money down, they can, and you don't need permission from the seller in order to do that. Buyer and the lender can decide on their own if they wanna make those adjustments, okay? All right, the next piece down here is this 2.2, which is saying that their ability to purchase the property to obtain the loan referenced in 2.1C either is or is not conditioned upon the sale of a property. If you check the box as is, make sure you attach the subject to the sale of the buyer's property addendum. Occasionally, and again, not typically at our brokerage, but we will see people from time to time check this box as is and then not include the subject to the sale of the buyer's property addendum. So if you check is, you also have to include the subject to the sale of the buyer's property addendum with the contract as well. Okay?
And it's better than it's done, right? Right?
It's what?
It's better that we make sure that we see that then,
Oh, yeah.
because if not, it can create problems, couldn't it?
Yeah, for sure. Well, for one thing, if you're representing the buyer and you don't include the addendum, it doesn't give them any protections to canceling the contract. They would only have the dates in due diligence and finance and appraisal.
And if I'm representing the seller,
Then that, you wouldn't care if you represent the seller, because it doesn't hurt your seller. If you represent the buyer, that would not be good. Does that make sense?
kind of.
Which is
No.
code for no.
Call for no. Okay, so it says, buyer's ability to purchase the property to obtain the loan reference in section 2 and above. It says is or is not conditioned upon the sale of real estate owner by buyer, right?
Correct.
So
And so-
why do you say it wouldn't hurt the seller?
Well, so no, I guess it could hurt the seller, meaning the deal might fall through. But as far as keeping the earnest money, it doesn't hurt the seller. The seller's got a better chance of keeping the earnest money. But the other problem is, this says, if checked in the affirmative, the terms of the attached subject to the sale buyer property addendum apply. So if you don't have that, you're missing part of the contract.
The addendum has to be there.
Yeah, you have to use the addendum.
Yeah, because I guess what I was going is,
But it just doesn't give this buyer as much protection if you didn't have it.
what I was going with that is if what you said it might not hurt the seller, if it didn't have an ending date, then it could hurt the seller because he'll be tied up to waiting and waiting and waiting.
Sure, yeah, no, well, so yes, great point on that. But you still have dates in section 24 that would apply.
And if those dates were not there,
Well, if those dates aren't there, then you need to come back through this class again.
Exactly.
Is the answer to that. You really messed up. But yeah, don't write one without dates there. 2, don't ever accept one without dates there.
yeah,
But to your point though, I have seen, and we've had in the last year, a scenario where somebody did leave it open-ended, where they didn't use the addendum, they just wrote their own. And it did put the seller in a bad spot because, yeah, there was nothing the seller could do to get out of the contract.
that's what I was talking.
Yeah, but that was because of how the verbiage was on the addendum that they had written, not because there wasn't one. Because if there's not one, then you would just rely on what the contract says in section 24, so. Yeah. Okay, next, settlement and closing. So this section here is explaining the difference between settlement and closing. So I always want to make sure you guys understand this. Settlement is going to take place no later than the settlement deadline in 24D, or unless agreed differently is what it's saying. But settlement shall occur only when the following have been completed. So in order for settlement to happen, there's certain things that have to happen. The first is the buyer and seller have signed and delivered to each other or to the escrow closing office all documents required by the REPC, by the lender, by the title insurance and escrow closing offices, by written escrow instructions, including any split transactions, or by applicable law. So that's the first thing. The first thing that has to happen is the buyer and seller have to have signed and delivered to each other or to the title company any documents that are required, basically. Okay, is what that's going on to say. So once you've done that, then the next thing is any monies required to be paid by the buyer and the seller under these documents. And notice this piece, except for the proceeds of any loan, have been delivered by the buyer or seller to the other party or to the escrow closing office in the form of cash, wire transfer, cashier's check, or other forms acceptable to the escrow closing office. So there's those two things that have to happen. One is you have to have signed all the applicable documents. Two, gotten the money there. Now, I want to make sure, because we saw this during this last year one time as well, that all the cash has to be there except for the proceeds of any loan. So sometimes people will go, well, we went and signed, we just couldn't wire the money yet for whatever reason. So then has settlement occurred? No. So would the buyer be in default then if they didn't send the money? The answer is yes, they would be, because you have to by settlement deadline, sign all the documents and send the money there. So something that we see quite often is where maybe the buyer can't follow through on their loan and the seller then, should they go sign at the title company?
The buyer doesn't have the funds.
So then what happens if the buyer doesn't show up because the loan's not ready, they don't have all the documents?
Well, he's in default, isn't it?
Okay, but wouldn't the seller also be in default then if they don't go and they gotta meet the deadlines of settlement as well?
How will the settlement, the seller will be in default?
Well, if they don't go to the title company and sign all of the applicable documents.
So in that case, like, isn't it between the seller and the buyer at that point? Because like, I had emergency surgery on a day we were signing on a house. I was in the hospital.
Okay.
And like, didn't make it to our closing because, so they came the next day, like our realtor and the title company came and we signed it over that day. But our sellers were great and wonderful, and like.
Yeah, as long as they're good with that.
But in that case, but I'm saying I can understand, like, if it's not okay, then I don't know what to do at that point.
Yeah, so that's where really your best bet, and I don't know that anybody's really pushed it yet to see what would happen if it did go to court, but just to be safe, you would be best to still, as the seller, show up and sign all the applicable documents that are related to the closing, because otherwise the buyer could make the argument, well, you defaulted too, because you didn't go sign.
So if you're selling, have them still show up and sign it, even if, because I guess nothing would transfer at that point, if they don't,
Right.
until they pay, it
Correct.
won't matter.
Right, won't matter.
And so even if I go sign, like if I'm the seller, it doesn't matter,
Nope.
because,
Because they're not going to record and do
paid the
anything
house.
until, because, that's where then the next pieces of this will come into play, is closing and
Okay.
possession. Go ahead.
I thought that what you were saying, that if the buyer didn't come up with the loan and all of that, I thought that it was implied that the seller did sign and did their part and just the buyer didn't.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying, is the seller you would still want your seller to go sign. So that they aren't also in default on the contract. Does that make sense?
So that won't happen, that the seller will be also in default. I
If
mean,
they
if
go
they
sign,
if
that
they
will not
sign and
happen,
all of
correct,
that.
correct. Okay, good, so then for closing, so for the purposes of the REPC, closing means that settlement has been completed, so that's all the documents signed and the money is transferred. The proceeds of any new loan have been delivered by the lender to the seller or the closing escrow office, and the applicable closing documents have been recorded in the office of the county recorder, and the actions above in 3.2 B and C, so B and C is the loan being funded, and C recorded, has to happen within 4 calendar days after settlement. So once you go sign everything and do settlement, then you have 4 days to get the loan all processed and everything recorded. That make sense? Okay. Next then is possession, and it's saying, well, Jason probably already went through the possession of either upon recording hours, after recording, or calendar days, so we're good there. Let's see.
Hey Russ, can I make a comment?
Yes, please.
Just on that last section, I think as a new agent, I didn't really realize that it could be, up to 4 days. Usually it wasn't, but it's always good to let your buyers know that it can be buyers or sellers. It can be, it's not necessarily going to happen when we want it to happen, depending on when all the monies get there, and everything. And I think just having a conversation with them helps with anything that could go awry, because sometimes it does.
Correct. Yes. Yeah, you got it. And that's just it. Most of the time, it's gonna happen next day, which I think is important to point out too. If you have a client coming from another state, they may be used to that in their state, because some states, when you go sign, all the money changes hands, they get the keys right then, like they're the owner of the property right then. Versus here, it's generally the next day. Most of the time it happens the next day. But it could, which is what Chris is saying, it could take up to 4. And so it is important to make sure both your buyers and your sellers understand that, is generally it's the next day, but it could be up to 4 calendar days.
So is that what Jason said, he doesn't like to close on Fridays?
Yeah,
Because it could be the weekend, and then it would be, because they don't record on calendar days.
correct,
They
yeah.
only record on business days.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, so for me, I generally like to try to always do mine if I'm either way, I try to like to try to do it for sure when I'm representing the buyer, more of like a Monday or a Tuesday. And the reason for that is twofold, is one, that gives you those few days, because they usually are wanting to move on a weekend, and same with a lot of times the seller wanting to move on a weekend. And I've found if you close on a Monday or a Tuesday, usually the seller will have moved out already, which makes it a lot easier for everything to happen. And I'll say more about that in a minute when we get to a different section, because I've got a scenario we're dealing with today, just this morning, that's related to something we'll talk about here in the contract.
I had a deal where I was working with somebody from the East Coast and he was coming over to Utah to buy an investment property. And at the closing table, he's like, "So where are my keys?" And we're like, "You don't get keys until it funds or until it records." And he's like, he was so mad and he so didn't believe me. He called his attorney back east and he's like, "This is crap. They're not giving me my keys and da da da." And so the attorney had to explain to him that, well, in Utah, this is how it works. And he was so mad, but it was my first client outside of Utah. So I didn't even think about how it's done differently in another state in that regard. So that was a big learning lesson when I was there.
That's awesome. Yeah, same for me. The first time I realized it was the same thing. I had somebody, and I want to say they were coming from Illinois, I think.
Mhm.
And it was the same scenario. It was when we signed there, we got the keys. And so yeah, anytime you're working with somebody from out of state, make sure that they understand how it typically works here in Utah. So, cool. All right, next, I'm gonna skip over prorations. I think I'll skip special assessments. If you guys have questions though, or wanna talk about it, let me know, but. Yeah, I'm gonna skip down to. Where should we go to? I'm just trying to think as I go through here if there's anything that really stands out that's important to.
So in
Understand.
those special assessments, Ross, or even the prorations, where the HOA is concerned, as a buyer's agent, is that why we are asking for the HOA documents? So we know that there is no outstanding fees that the seller might be wanting to pass on?
Yeah, good question. So, yes, the idea of once we get into the seller disclosure section is, the reason you want to know about that is there may be a special assessment coming up that if you didn't have the HOA docs to see from their minutes from their last meeting, at which, by the way, I personally think you want to get more than just one, the last meeting. I think it's worth asking for 2 or 3 because my wife, we live in a planned unit development, so we've got an HOA, and my wife is the HOA president, and I just know, like, she's got a meeting tonight, but I just know that there are times that it's like, we're not gonna have a lot of people there, or let's table that discussion for a little bit. And so you might get the most recent minutes and they might not discuss something that has been discussed in the past that maybe the next meeting they will discuss. So for me personally, especially just having now lived in this HOA, I'm like, it's probably worth getting more than one, the most recent minutes. You might wanna get 2 or 3 just to review so that you know for sure what is going on.
Because there could be some improvements in there that are not going to be done when the seller is right there, but they are coming up, let's say, I don't know, 2 or 3 months after the new owner is there.
Yep, and I have seen that where the buyer moves in and then gets this assessment and they're like, what? Nobody told me. And it's like, well, they provided to you what they were required by the contract. Now, if they do know, if the seller does know, they still would have an obligation to disclose that if they knew. But I will, again, same thing, prior to my wife being the HOA president, I didn't know a lot that was going on in the neighborhood that way, but, so, yeah. Okay, let's see. That's probably good. So let's talk about seller disclosures. Okay, so on seller disclosures, no later than the seller disclosure deadline in 24A, the seller has to provide all of this stuff, A through L, okay? Now, what tends to happen though is most agents will send over the written seller property condition disclosures, but they don't worry about sending all the rest of this stuff. So at one point, this has been a few years, but at one point, there were some people that were going around, and what they would do is they would go make an offer on a property and they would put earnest money of like $25,000. So we're gonna put down $25,000 earnest money and I'm gonna write an offer on Dayton's listing. But I'm gonna put that I have the seller disclosure deadline. So I'm gonna write an offer, $25,000 earnest money. I'm gonna just offer you exactly what you're asking for, and yet I'm gonna put seller disclosure deadline to be tomorrow. So I send you over so I call up and I say, Dayton, I'm gonna be sending you an offer. Do you think we could get it accepted today? It's really important we get it accepted today. He says, yeah, sure, I can get with my seller. Great. I put tomorrow as the seller disclosure deadline. I send over to him the offer, $25,000 earnest money. He accepts it. Now that means by tomorrow, you gotta give me seller property condition disclosures, a commitment for the title insurance, a copy of the CC&Rs, copy of the most recent minutes, budget, financial statements, any long-term leases, short-term leases, existing property management agreements, water shares or water rights, or any notices and claims, and then if they're a foreign person. Well, that's great if he can meet that deadline. But there are a lot of times where agents don't send over the CC&Rs or they don't send over the commitment for title insurance. So I send him the offer, $25,000 earnest money. He sends over the seller disclosures tomorrow, but does not send over the commitment for the title insurance, doesn't send a copy of the CC&Rs. So the next day I go in and go, hey, we're canceling the contract because you're in default. And we'll talk about what that means down in section 16. But in essence, that would mean they owe me I get my $25,000 back, plus now your seller owes me an additional $25,000. So there were, and like I say, we haven't seen this for a number of years now, but for a while, there were people that were doing that, writing offers with the intention of they're gonna cancel, hoping that you default. Now, what if he did send over all that stuff to me? Well, then they just canceled and took their earnest money and went to try to find the next person that wouldn't do it. So I tell you all of that just as a reminder, when you're looking at that seller disclosure deadline, make sure you're looking at, do I have all of this stuff and can I provide it within that time frame? And if you can't, then do a counter offer on that seller disclosure deadline to give yourself a few more days to get those things put together.
So what you're saying, Ross, this is not just for the seller disclosures, but there is all of this documentation that is needed.
Correct. You gotta have everything provided by the seller disclosure deadline. So that's where it says, up here, no later than the seller disclosure deadline referenced in 24A, seller shall provide to the buyer the following documents in hard copy or electronic format, which are collectively referred to as seller disclosures. So all of these things would be the seller disclosures, not just the actual seller property condition disclosure form.
So that needs to change the
What?
name. No seller disclosures.
No, we just need to do our job.
No seller
That's just
disclosures,
up to
but
you, you have to,
all
you have to be
papers.
aware.
All papers.
Yeah.
Yep, said everything.
So just as a reminder, like I said, I haven't seen that for a long time, so it's hopefully not like you don't have to stress too much, but I would say, just keep in mind, so there is something that is called the first breach rule, that basically what that means is that if one party breaches on the contract, so misses something like this, the other party is no longer held to anything else really in the contract. So that's called the first breach rule. Once somebody, so I'll give you an example, because we just had this actually within the last month, is we had an agent who wrote an offer on a property, the sellers never even gave them the 7A. They never even gave them the written seller property condition disclosure. They continued throughout the transaction, and then after finance and appraisal deadline, after due diligence, the buyer all of a sudden wanted out of the contract, and we were able to release $9,000 back to our buyer based on the fact that they never provided seller disclosure, so that put the sellers now in breach. So now the buyer can't be held to anything else in the contract. So part of why I say that is you don't want to be in the scenario that you created for your client, that they are the first ones to breach on the contract, because then the other party can breach and there's nothing they can do about it.
But they can breach, but I mean, they will want some compensation
Who?
most of the time. The party that is, oh, you didn't give me whatever you didn't give me, but then they want compensation for that.
So yeah, so that's a
aside
good
from-
point. The buyers probably could have said, not only do we get our $9,000 back, you owe us $9,000 because you
Because of that.
defaulted on the contract, but we didn't do that. We just,
You just wanted the money back.
just took the money and said, okay, we're moving on.
Well, I just was thinking, according to what you said, that these other, in the past, that wanted to have this conflict, and then I get my money back, but I want the same amount from you.
Yeah, which they could have, and we'll get to that in section 16, but, so just as a reminder, it's everything listed here, okay?
Okay.
All right.
What's the usual timeline?
For seller disclosures? So I don't know that there is a usual. The way that I typically do it when I'm representing a buyer is I will usually give I will put somewhere between 3 and 5 days on seller disclosures. You will have agents, probably the most common thing that agents do is, and let me just scroll down to section 24, is probably the most common thing that agents do is put 7, now don't write 7 days, but they'll look at a calendar
Yeah,
and put in a date that is 7 days.
okay.
Down here is they usually do 14, this one is 21, and this one's 28 or 30. That's kind of the most common way.
Okay.
But for me, if I'm representing the buyer, and the way I decide between 3 and 5, if I'm gonna do 3 days or 5 days here, for me, I decide it based on, if I feel like I'm giving Dayton a full price offer, I'm probably putting 3 days, because I'm like, we're not gonna spend days negotiating. But if I'm like, yeah, we're gonna be sending a lower offer over, we might have to negotiate a while, I might put 5 days there. So, but I would say when you're on the listing side, you might want it to be 7 days just so that you have ample time, unless you know you have all of the stuff
That
listed.
information.
You might want a few more days just to be safe to get it.
Russ,
Yes.
sometimes when it just depends, like how quickly, if I'm trying to do a really good offer, and I'm trying to get our due diligence done, I will ask the seller, can we have a, short, get those, all of the seller's disclosures to me before we go and do a, inspection. So, because I want those before the inspection. So I need to see if there's anything on there that we need to look at. So I might shorten them based on when our inspection is.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I do think it is a really good idea to have received the seller disclosures before you do your inspection, just so that you can look through them to see, do we need to look at stuff on there? So, which we did have something with that in the last week too, where another one that is, there's a dispute over the earnest money because there was some the appraiser said there was problems with the foundation. The seller disclosures just said there were cracks, and anyway, it became a big issue. But yeah, I think it's a good idea because if you have those seller disclosures and they point something out, and in fact, I would say you want to give extra attention to stuff that's put on the seller disclosures, because once the seller has disclosed it, it's buyer beware. Like, if the seller pointed out there were cracks and you bought the house and then go back later and go, hey, there's problems with the foundation, a judge is probably gonna say, well, what did you do to check it out? They told you there were cracks, so.
So if the buyer offers to buy it as is, it really wouldn't matter as much. Like, I mean, we still filled out the seller disclosure, but like our offer that we accepted was as is.
So actually, the section 10 down here
Uh-huh.
says that the property is sold as is anyway.
Oh, okay.
Let me find where it's
That's
at.
right, their property, it says the.
Buyer acknowledges and agrees that in reference to the physical condition of the property, the buyer is purchasing the property in its as-is condition without expressed or implied warranties of any kind. So, but that's why it would be a buyer beware, is because the seller still has to disclose. Even if you're buying it as is, the seller still has to disclose what they know. But
I was just curious, cause like we went under contract on Thursday and they had their inspector in there on Friday.
On Friday.
We didn't have time to, we got it in there, by Friday evening, but like, cause my husband's already on top of it, but like, I don't know, I was just curious.
yeah,
It's learning all the things as I'm selling a house.
yeah, no,
It's
you're
kinda
good.
fun.
It is fun to do it that way, for sure. But
As I'm,
yeah,
like reading the contracts at the same time.
but yeah, every property is actually sold as is. So, but that doesn't mean the seller doesn't have to disclose.
Yeah,
They still do have to disclose.
Oh no, we are big disclosure people, cause we already sued the
Yeah.
first time we bought a house.
Oh, did you?
Yes, they did not disclose the sewer line was bad, and 3 months later it backed up, and we had to do the entire flood line and replace the sewer line. So we went after the
Did you win?
Took a year and a half, people don't talk about that, but yes, finally he mediated,
Okay.
2 days before court, the day before court, he settled with us.
Oh, so, yeah, which, that's pretty normal, so. Yeah,
We would have won a lot more.
they
the
definitely,
next day.
yeah, lawsuits are not quick. Like, we actually are involved in one right now over $1 million earnest money issue
It was, yeah.
that has been going on for 4 years. And
What?
it's still not even really, I don't think, close to settled. But
People don't, it takes so long, like it's not, when
Yeah.
you go after, it's not.
it's not a short
No.
thing, yeah.
And
How
now
do you
it's-
ended up with $1 million earnest money?
It was a $10 million house. So, yeah, that's a whole nother story. But anyway, okay.
Anyway, sorry.
No, you're good.
I asked questions as I learned.
No, I'm glad you did. Yeah, in fact, I would rather you guys, if the whole time we just sat and answered questions, it would be awesome. So I'm good with that. All right, next section is due diligence. Just a couple things to point out on this is that the buyer's obligation to purchase is or is not conditioned upon the buyer's due diligence. And down under the buyer's right to cancel. So this is the key piece I want to make sure everybody understands. If the buyer determines in the buyer's sole discretion, And so that's the key words. In the buyer's sole discretion that the results of the due diligence are unacceptable, they can either by the due diligence deadline cancel, get the earnest money back, or they could try to put something in writing to resolve their objections, okay? So prior to that due diligence deadline, the buyer could cancel just for any reason, no reason. So the key thing for you guys to understand and know is really it's best if you are canceling based on section 8.1B here, just their right to cancel. Don't give a reason. Just tell them we're canceling based on section 8.1B.
Okay.
And if they say to you, well, why? You don't have to tell them. Just in the buyer's sole discretion, they're wanting to cancel. And that's all that it is, okay? Now, I'm not saying you couldn't tell them, you can, but you don't have to. So if the buyer doesn't want to, you don't have to. If the buyer's okay with you telling them, that's fine too, so. All right, the next one that I want to hit on is the appraisal condition. And this one is the buyer's right to cancel. So this one is a key one to make sure that you understand on this, okay? So if after the completion of an appraisal by a licensed appraiser, buyer receives written notice from the lender or the appraiser that the property is appraised for less than the purchase price. So in parentheses, what that means is if they receive written notice from either the lender or the appraiser, that whatever that written notice they got is called the notice of appraised value, okay? So whatever they get in writing, whether it's the appraisal itself or just an email even from the lender saying to you, the property didn't appraise, that would be considered the notice of appraised value. So then the buyer can cancel by providing written notice to the seller, and then here's the key, because this is the piece that agents don't do, with a copy of the notice of appraised value. So you have to give them the cancellation and the notice of appraised value. So whether that's the appraisal itself, which I probably wouldn't recommend that you give to them the appraisal. We had one recently that we're dealing with where the agent did send over a copy of the appraisal itself, and it appraised value-wise, but there were some other issues on the appraisal. And so the other agent now is making the argument, hey, it appraised for value. But we're making the argument that it really didn't appraise. So my recommendation is just send something in writing from either the appraiser or the lender that says that it didn't appraise.
No,
So you
yeah,
don't
please.
have to
Not the
get-
actual appraisal. Not the actual appraisal.
No, yeah, I would recommend not the actual appraisal.
Especially if it didn't, if it was the right price, I mean, appraised for the right price, but there were other issues.
Yeah.
So especially in that one, it's better not to.
Yeah, and on the one that we had, the issues were, it was back to that foundation, was the appraiser said, hey, I'm not sure this is structurally sound, and they had a structural engineer go look at the property. The structural engineer said, it doesn't look like anything new is happening, so it should be fixed, it just doesn't have to be fixed now. But the appraiser said, I don't care, I want it fixed. And so the seller's making the argument, the structural engineer said it doesn't have to be fixed, but we're making the argument, the appraiser said it does. So,
Because would that affect like FHA loans and stuff
well,
like that?
yeah,
at
and
that
on,
point?
on the first page of the appraisal, the appraiser put the value was contingent upon that being done.
Okay.
So we're making the argument, because it wasn't done, it didn't appraise, because the value was contingent upon that.
That makes sense.
So Ross, you're saying if the agent didn't send the original document and just say it didn't appraise, then you wouldn't be facing.
We
what
wouldn't
you're
be facing this at all, because they would have then said, well, what did it appraise for?
But that would be easier
Yeah,
than
so the
the other way?
the bigger challenge on it is what happened is the lender told the buyer, hey, the value's good. So the buyer texted the agent, said, hey, just heard from the lender, the value's good. So then our agent said to the listing agent, hey, the value appraisal's good. Then we had to go back later on saying, well, it actually isn't good because of blah, blah, blah. So anyway,
Oh.
so yeah, we're still kind of fighting that a little bit, but. All right, financing condition. So but here's what happens on the financing condition. So the buyer's right to cancel before the financing and appraisal deadline. So if after the due diligence deadline, the buyer decides to cancel based on finance, and again, I want to point out, if the buyer, and then the keywords again being in, I want to highlight, come on. In the buyer's sole discretion is not satisfied with the terms of the loan, the buyer may cancel after the due diligence referenced in 24B, but if it's before the finance and appraisal deadline, then X amount of earnest money would be at risk. So whatever a dollar amount gets put in here, if the buyer were to cancel after due diligence but before finance and appraisal, they would lose however much money you put in right there.
So should we put 0 then?
If you're representing the buyer, you want to put, my recommendation is put 0 if I'm representing the buyer. If I'm representing the seller, I want probably half at least in there.
When you have 20 offers, that stands out a lot.
Big time, yeah.
Because we took the one that had $2,000
Yeah,
non-refundable.
yeah, because then you're like, hey,
And
if
we're
they don't.
not, then we have the mortgage payment that we
Yep,
would lose.
Yep.
So I mean, that was like,
a big deal, yeah.
that's an extra one.
So, but when I'm representing the buyer, I want it to be 0, but yeah, if you're in a multiple offer scenario, you probably don't want to put 0 there, because you want to try to, so for that, it's always a good idea to call the listing agent and say, what is most important to your seller? What do they want?
Well, we
to
hadn't
see?
said that, but they agreed, but like.
Yeah. So, but yeah, it's a good idea. All right,
Well, and if you're a great agent, because he knows their agent, he's like, no, they're a great agent, so they put it in there, I didn't have to talk to him about it.
didn't even have to ask, yeah.
Because they know if in a multiple situation,
Yeah,
I wanna make my offer stand out.
yep. Yeah, during COVID, it was nuts because of all that.
2022 was great.
So what is the most crazy thing you saw during COVID right here?
Oh, people, I wouldn't necessarily say the most crazy, but people were doing $20,000 non-refundable. We won't, if we do cancel, you get to keep our money, and
When we tried to buy a house, people were offering $30,000 or $40,000, $50,000 over asking,
Yeah.
and then with huge non-refundables.
huge non-refundable earnest.
No appraisal necessary, I mean, it was like,
Yep,
it was,
Yep.
buying a house in 2022 was like
yeah.
a sad day. It took
A sad day for the buyer.
It was a sad day for everybody,
For a buyer, no,
yeah,
like,
other than the
and
seller, I
you would
guess.
like look at it and within like half a day there'd be 25 offers and you're like, well, like, okay, I mean, I wasn't even a realtor then, we were just trying to buy a house.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, it was a
and
big.
it was, anyway, but yeah, okay, I was just curious, like that's.
Yep.
Interesting.
All right, let's see, let's go down to the section 10. So let's go through this and talk about this, the condition of the property, okay? Okay, so we already did the as-is part, but so the buyer's acknowledging and agreeing that the physical condition of the property, that they're purchasing it in as-is condition without expressed or implied warranties of any kind. Buyer shall have during the due diligence referenced in 8.1 an opportunity to complete inspections and evaluate the condition of the property. And if based on the buyer's discretion they elect to proceed with the property, they're relying wholly on their own judgment and that of any contractors, inspectors to review, blah, blah, blah. The next section, and this one is the one I was telling you I would bring up that we're dealing with today. I got an email today from a buyer. We had the listing, but the buyer of the properties now emailed me today because of this section here. So the seller acknowledges and agrees that in reference to the physical condition of the property, seller agrees to A, disclose in writing to buyer defects of the property known to the seller. So even though it's as is, the seller is agreeing to disclose any defects that they know that could materially affect the value of the property that cannot be discovered by a reasonable inspection by an ordinary prudent buyer. So basically what that means, if there was a huge hole in this wall right here, I don't have to write that on the seller disclosures because it's obvious. But if I had the huge hole there and I put a picture over the front of it, now you better disclose that there's a hole behind it. Okay, does that make sense? That's what that's getting at. Okay, so B is carefully review, complete, and provide to the buyer a written property disclosure, condition disclosure as stated in 7A. C, deliver the property to the buyer in substantially the same general condition as it was on the date of acceptance as defined in section 23. Ordinary wear and tear accepted, so like they don't have, because the lawn was mowed on the day it was accepted, they don't have to mow it again, right before. Just normal wear and tear is fine. D, deliver the property to the buyer in broom clean condition and free of debris and personal belongings. So the email I got today with photographs is, look at the condition that the seller left the property in, and we called the listing agent and they basically said, sorry, which unfortunately, that's kind of true. It is kind of a sorry scenario, because is the brokerage responsible to make sure it's broom clean and free of debris? Yes, we have the obligation to tell our seller, you need to do this, but if they don't do it, the hard part for me is I'm not really sure what I can do for this buyer other than be like, yeah, sorry, it's crappy.
So what did they leave?
What did they leave?
Yeah, how bad was it?
The house itself is clean, but there was a shed and they just left all the junk they didn't want basically in the shed. Not everything, but just random stuff that, the buyer probably didn't want. So anyway, it is good though for you on the listing side to make sure your seller knows it has to be broom clean and free of debris and personal belongings. So they can't leave that stuff behind. So I don't know what's gonna happen. I'll reply back and say, oh, I'm so sorry that happened. It's frustrating, and I know, this is what we've let our seller know. They basically said, we're gone, and so.
And then they didn't see that in the last walkthrough?
So that's the thing, back to when I said I like the idea of trying to close on a Monday or Tuesday, because then hopefully the seller moves out over the weekend.
Yeah.
That way you can go do your walkthrough, and if you found that there was stuff left behind, you can deal with it before closing. Because once you close, there's not a whole lot of recourse, other than small claims court, but that's it.
That's a lot more money than just
Yeah.
moving it all out to the
So
top.
before the closing date, then, to make sure that the property,
Is broom clean and free of debris and personal belongings. Okay, last section of this says repair any seller or tenant moving related damage to the property at the seller's expense. So I just think it's always a good idea to make sure when you're representing the seller to be explaining, you gotta leave it broom clean, free of debris and personal belongings. Any damage that you cause while you're moving, which is, somebody's gonna hit a wall, almost guaranteed, they're responsible to fix that if they break something.
With section, on that very last sentence of section 10.3, it says the provisions of section 10.3 shall survive closing. So how would you explain that in the situation you're talking about with these people calling and saying, hey, this isn't done properly?
Yeah, good. So, that's an excellent question. So the reason that some of these sections do have that in there that say that it'll survive closing is because if we didn't have that in there, once the property's closed, there's no more agreements between the buyer and the seller if you don't have that in there. So basically what you would have to do is tell the seller in this scenario is, hey, you could end up being responsible if these buyers decide to go to small claims court. So ultimately, if I were representing the buyer, I would say, pay somebody to do it, get it taken care of, and then from there, we'll send the bill to the seller for these repairs. But if the seller doesn't do it, then you're gonna have to go to small claims court to get a judge to give a judgment that says, yeah, they do owe the money. Then you gotta collect on the judgment, so.
Isn't it unless they also click shall mediate first?
Oh, that's true, yes. If you had checked shall mediate, then you gotta mediate before you. Yes. All right, next, which we just talked about, the walkthrough inspection, so make sure you're doing that. And just because if you do the walkthrough before they moved out, doesn't mean they don't have to still leave it broom clean and free of debris, so. All right, let's see. For the sake of time, we're gonna skip down to section 16. So buyer default. So what happens if the buyer defaults? If the buyer defaults, the seller has three options. One is they can cancel the REPC and retain the earnest money deposit. So this, if the buyer defaults, seller gets to keep the earnest money as liquidated damages. B, or two, maintain the earnest money deposit or deposits in trust and sue the buyer to specifically enforce the REPC, which that one's gonna be harder to do. If they're getting a loan and they're denied the loan, good luck trying to force them to buy the property if they can't get a loan, so. Or three, or C, return the earnest money deposit or deposits to the buyer and pursue other remedies available at law. Now, let me point out though, if the seller takes the earnest money, if they accept that, they are accepting that as liquidated damages. So if they take the earnest money, they can't really go after the seller to sue them for default.
Have anybody tried
Or,
to do both?
excuse me, the buyer for default.
Have anybody tried to do both?
To try to do both? Well, they may have tried to, I don't know, I'm not sure, but I'm sure somebody has tried to and the judge would look at it and say, no, you took that as liquidated damages. That was, so you're already pre-agreeing that if you default and I take the earnest money, then I'm made whole. And that's it.
Has anyone really chose option C that often?
To give the earnest money back and go after him? Not
Yes,
very.
I have.
You have? Leslie?
I have.
Okay.
So I had a buyer that found for sale by owner, and we had negotiated with them, and then so they were for sale by owner, but they were talking to an agent trying to get like, well, how do we do this exactly? And the agent just gave them all this information, but then they put the house up for sale. We went under contract. They went to a lender to then go buy their next house, and the lender denied them. So now they can no longer buy a house. And so they're like, oh, well, we're not going to sell you the house. So maybe this isn't the exact same situation, sorry. But so my buyers are like, no, we've already given our notice. We've already, done all this stuff. So if you try and cancel this contract, we will take you to court and we will fight to buy this home. And so these people literally sold the house to my buyers and had no place to go because their credit had gone bad. So they were even struggling trying to find an apartment to live in.
Did you say that they were for sale by owners?
Yeah, they were for sale by owners.
Hmm.
And they didn't know that that a seller can't get out of the contract.
Yeah.
So sorry, that was a different situation than this. But
You're good.
I apologize.
But we're still interested. We liked it.
Situation, you put like a contingent on the contract for like buying another house, right?
Yep, there's an addendum that you could make it contingent upon you finding a.
Mhm.
Yep.
So they were for sale by owner and they did not know that. And I figured they told us, we're talking to another agent and she's helping us to do this. And we're like, okay. So.
That's crazy. Cool, thank you. Okay, seller default. So 16.2, if the seller defaults, then the buyer gets to elect one of the following, and they have three remedies too. First one for them is they can cancel the REPC, and in addition to the return of the earnest money, deposit or deposits, buyer may elect to accept from the seller, again, as liquidated damages. So if they choose this option, then they get a sum equal to the earnest money deposit. So they get their earnest money back plus, so sometimes you'll hear agents say, well, you get double the earnest money. Well, that's not true. They get their earnest money back and then they get an amount equal to it. So it's not like they get double the earnest money because the earnest money was already theirs. Yeah. So, but you'll hear agents say, well, you get double the earnest money. That's not true. You get your earnest money back plus an amount equal to it from the seller. And this, the seller is already pre-agreeing to that. So that's one option. Second option is they can keep the earnest money in trust and sue the seller to enforce the contract, which that doesn't happen often, but could happen. And C, or three, accept the return of the earnest money deposit and pursue any other remedies available at law. So if the buyer elects to accept liquidated damages, seller agrees to pay the liquidated damages, so.
And that was my situation that I was talking about, so I apologize for that.
Yeah, no, you're good.
So in her case, like with that, if the buyer, like the sellers couldn't afford it, right? They could have taken him to court
Yes.
or.
Well, they could try to specifically enforce the,
So, but like, let's say they did have that contingency and then they weren't able to get that funding, it would have been,
then
it
you're,
wouldn't have mattered because it's contingency, so.
right. And that addendum spells out what happens if not.
Okay,
So,
fine.
Yep,
So in her case, the sellers could have offered to give the same amount of earnest money as liquidated damages. They could have offered and
so they
said,
could offer it, yes, but it's the buyer gets to try, the buyer, if the seller defaults, the buyer gets to choose one of these. Yep, the buyer may elect, so it's up to the
always
buyer.
do the addendum.
so in that case, they elected to enforce the REPC,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, they had said we can give you your earnest money back, and we talked to our clients, and my client was like, no, we want the house, and we will take them to court. And so that's what we told the sellers, and so the
Yep.
sellers had no choice.
Yeah. Cool, okay, next, so we're gonna hit 2 more sections here and then we'll be done. So the next one we're gonna talk about is notices. So this one's important to make sure you understand, because again, I've had recently, within the last couple of weeks, somebody trying to tell me that we had provided notice when actually we had not provided notice. So for notice, except as provided in section 23, which we'll talk about next, all notices required under the REPC must be, and then there's 3 things: in writing, signed by the buyer or seller who's giving notice, and C, or 3, received by the buyer or seller or their respective agent or by the brokerage firm representing the buyer or seller no later than the applicable date referenced in the REPC. So anytime you're providing notice, it has to meet 3 categories: in writing, signed by the party giving notice, and received by either the seller, the buyer, their agent, or their brokerage firm. So just know, when you're providing notice, if you couldn't get a hold of the other agent, you could just go take it to their brokerage or call up and say, hey, I need the broker's email address and I'm sending this over. And as long as it's received by them. But those 3 things have to happen is in order for notice to have been given: in writing, signed by the party giving notice, and received by the seller or the buyer, the agent, or their firm representing them. Okay? Next that we'll do, and then we'll just wrap up here, is acceptance. So acceptance only occurs when all of the following have occurred. And seller or the buyer has signed the offer or the counteroffer where noted to indicate acceptance, and seller or buyer or their agent has communicated it to the other party. So notice had to be signed, or in writing, signed, and received. This just has to be signed and communicated to the other party. So there have been scenarios where an agent's called up and said, hey, just want to let you know we're accepting your offer, but maybe it hasn't been signed yet. So if they communicated that, but it hadn't been signed, it's still not accepted. So if somebody ever calls you and says, hey, we are going to accept your offer, or we accepted your offer, your follow-up question should be, have they signed it?
Is it signed?
Yeah, is it signed? Because if yes, then you're good, you've got acceptance. Because it has to be signed and communicated. So let's see. I think that's probably good for today. Any other questions, anything?
I have a question about, I know there was comments about like notice and how people use it like through just like text messages. I can't remember what the specific rules on that kind of stuff was, but I just remember that being a discussion that people talked about with like agents texting and that being like.
So yeah, good. So under notices where it's saying, so there is still some ambiguity on that a little bit. I don't know that we have an exact answer, but it definitely does. So a text message, let's check it and see, is it in writing?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is it signed by the buyer or seller giving the notice?
A text message.
So the hard part with that is where it's not, if they put like a signature on it where it had their name, then you could argue, yeah, they signed it because they put their name on it. So I kind of tend to feel like you got a pretty good case to argue, especially if like it was a screenshot of from the buyer, the seller to the agent, you know, and the agent was saying, hey, my client is providing this notice. I mean, here's what I will tell you, the very best thing is just put it in writing, get it signed by your client and send it over, because then there's no question. But a text message, I tend to want to say, I think it's a pretty good argument you could fight with, but you still do have that little bit of a, well, was it signed?
Yeah.
And I don't know that we have an exact answer on that.
Okay.
Eventually it'll probably be considered,
My guess is that it's leaning that way for sure, but
because so many people text versus call.
So Ross, what is the notice
Oh,
deal
did I?
that you are dealing right now with?
what's the one? Oh,
Because they say you are dealing with
oh
something.
yeah, the one that we're dealing with right now on it was a scenario that the agent, it was the cancellation. Our agent said, hey, my client might cancel, but they had actually already signed the cancellation. And so the other agent's saying, you said you might cancel, but they actually had already signed the cancellation. And so I pointed the agent to this and said, so is it in writing? Yes. Was it signed by the buyer or seller giving notice? Yes. But had you received it? No. So it didn't matter until you received it, the notice hadn't been given. And there's nothing wrong with a seller saying to you, hey, we're gonna go ahead and sign this, but then we'll let you know in the morning if we wanna cancel or not. I mean, just because they signed it, has to be signed and received. Otherwise, because if they don't receive it, then, so the notice section doesn't say anything about communication. The agent was basically the agent was saying this, it had been signed and communicated. Well, that's fine for acceptance, but a cancellation falls under notice, because except as provided in section 23, all notices have to be in writing, signed by the buyer or seller giving notice, and received. They hadn't received it, so there was no notice. There you go.
Okay,
All right, any other questions?
no, thank you.
Okay, well, thanks for being here. So Thursday, the class Thursday will be CMA. So we're gonna take a property that I used to own, it was my first house I ever bought. We're gonna do a CMA on that to let you guys tell me what you think the value of the house is.
The one that you regretted selling?
I still regret selling because, well, you'll see why when you do it.
Probably worth a lot more money.
It's worth a lot more money today, yeah, so. Okay,
Yes.
thanks for being here, guys.
Thank you.
See ya.
Thank you.
Thanks, Russ.
You bet.
Thank you.
Sorry, I asked a lot of questions.
Oh, you're good. I told you, I appreciate the questions. I like it when we have all the questions. It
We
makes
better
it
ask you
less-
questions than go to court, Ross.
What?
We better ask you questions than go to court.
Yes, for sure. I would rather you ask me questions than
Saves a lot of headache later on.
yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.